for this podcast, Radju EU, powered by Eurodesk. And today we shall dig deeper into the subject related to culture and identity with Dr. Michael Briguglio. But who is Dr. Michael Briguglio? Michael Briguglio has a doctorate in sociology and is a senior lecturer at the University of Malta within the Department of Sociology. He is one of the founders of the Malta Sociological Association and is a board member of Research Network 25 Social Movements of the European Sociological Association. Dr. Briguglio has been involved in civil society and environmental activism since the mid-90s. His activism commenced in 1994 with Movement Graffiti, and he was a co-founder of various successful civil society initiatives, including Front Contra il Golf Course and the Yes Movement for the introduction of divorce. He was also a local councillor, chaired Alternativa Democratica, the Green Party, and contested the European parliamentary elections with the PN. Am I right, Dr. Briguglio?
Yes.
And I welcome you on board, Dr. Briguglio, and thank you on behalf of Agenzia Zaza and Eurodesk for being part of this podcast. Today we shall be discussing culture and identity. And with youth workers who work very closely with the young people, do understand and also face many questions such as brought forward by the young people themselves, such as who am I, in which culture do I belong? Can you explain, for the benefit of our listeners and youth workers as myself, what is actually meant by culture and identity?
Yes, there are various ways of looking at culture. The way how I look at it also as a sociologist is that culture refers to our everyday life. What we do in our everyday life, what we associate ourselves with in our everyday life. So culture is not something up there. Culture is something which we live. It's how we associate ourselves, and very often identity has very much to do with culture. When it comes to identity, I prefer to speak of identities. We don't just have one identity within each and every one of us. For example, I might associate myself with a particular gender, with a particular faith, or with no particular faith, with a political belief perhaps, with a football team, with a genre of music, with so many aspects of our everyday lives. And there are identities which we associate ourselves with, and sometimes also other people can associate ourselves with identity, sometimes in a positive way, sometimes even in a negative way.
So what you're saying is that other people can associate us with other factors which create an identity, not which I have created, but others have created for me?
Yes. For example, unfortunately, we still see examples of racism, homophobia, for example, sexism, discrimination against certain people because of their skin color or because of their political beliefs or because of who they belong to. And sometimes you might, for example, believe that everyone is equal, but somebody might look down upon you because of the color of your skin or because of your sexuality. So in that sense, someone is imposing an identity upon you and perhaps is discriminating against you in this regard. But identity can also be something positive. For example, in the past years in Malta, we have seen how the LGBTIQ identities in this regard have come out of the closet, so to speak, and have opened up, have empowered themselves, but have also been very active for the introduction of a lot of policies and laws which in this sense were positive. They were policies of inclusion. So whereas, for example, 30, 40, 50 years ago, if you were somebody who was gay, perhaps you wouldn't tell anyone because maybe you would be afraid of stigma.
Yes.
Today, if you are someone who is gay, you have the same rights as someone who is heterosexual. So, for example, we speak of same-sex marriages, for example. We speak of a diversity of rights. So, identity can be something which you associate yourself with. It can be something which somebody else associates you with. And then identity can also be recognized by law. So, going back to the LGBTIQ issue,
Yes.
whereas previously our laws in Malta, for example, only recognized one type of marriage, that is marriage between people of the opposite sex. Today, and in the past years, Malta recognizes marriage even between persons of the same sex. So in this regard, the LGBTIQ identity is also being recognized by law.
So what you're saying is identity and culture go in hand in hand, because in reality an identity forms your own culture.
Yes.
Am I right? You mentioned particular factors which we come across in our society, which have to do with ethics. What are some of the ethics that arise from identity? Because you mentioned people who are homophobic and racist, and as soon as you mentioned those, ethics came to my mind.
Yes, I think one of the biggest challenges regarding identity today is where are we going to draw a line? Now, what does this mean? We are living in a day and age where on the one hand you have people, organizations, political parties, NGOs, social movements who are saying that we should be as open as possible as regards identities. So, for example, that society should recognize different sexualities, different gender identities, different religious beliefs, different political beliefs, and so forth. And on the other hand, you have others who are saying that societies are losing, in inverted commas, their values because they are opening up too much. Now, the issue is, where are we going to draw a line? For example, if you are in favor of opening up, and personally, I believe that societies should be as open as possible. But does that mean that, for example, you should also accept racist beliefs? Now, my answer to that would be that somewhere you have to draw a line. Where should you draw a line? I'm not here to give a precise answer, but I believe that lines should be drawn once you have an identity which affects another identity in a negative way. So, for example, if you say my identity doesn't accept other cultures, like that you are closing the doors towards other people. So that should be something which should not be acceptable. But if you are saying, I wish that my identity is included together with those of others, as for example was the case with the LGBTIQ identity, when some years ago some very brave activists stood up and said, we wish that we have the same rights as other people who love persons of the opposite sex, but in our case, we love persons of our sex, if we are speaking of gay people, for example, or lesbians. In that case, they weren't proposing to take something from anyone else or to reduce the rights of others. They were speaking in terms of having their identity included in society. So, this is a very complicated issue, but I believe that we should draw a line once an identity takes something from somebody else. So, for example, in a democratic society, I believe that all views are welcome, liberal, conservative, progressive, but if your identity is saying, for example, let people drown in the sea if they are seeking for a better life, that isn't something that should be acceptable. But on the other hand, as a sociologist, I have to try to understand why there are people who have racist beliefs, for example. It doesn't mean that I agree with them. I am anti-racist. But I have to try and understand why is it that some people have racist beliefs? What is leading them to have racist beliefs? And one has to try to understand. In sociology, we use a term which comes from a sociologist called Max Weber. It is a German word, verstehen, which means to understand. You have to try to understand the society around you, even when you try to understand things which you disagree with, like criminality, like racism, for example. You have to try to understand why is it that they exist. So hopefully we can be more empathic and create a more inclusive society.
Is it easy for a community or for a person to somehow shift its identity or its culture? How often does this happen? I mean, because we are constantly changing. We are human beings, we're alive, so on and so forth. But is it very that effective that a person changes its identity completely at such a so suddenly? Let's put it this way.
Yes. Society is characterized, at one go, it is characterized by both reproduction and transformation. Society reproduces itself, but also transforms itself. Let me give you an example with Maltese society. Many Maltese people associate themselves with Catholicism. Not everyone does, but many do. But the Catholicism of today is not exactly the same Catholicism of 100 years ago. So even Catholicism, which tends to be a rather conservative approach, changes with time. Who knows, maybe in the future Catholicism will accept women priests, for example. There are things which Catholicism didn't accept 100 years ago, which Catholicism accepts today. Even if you look at different popes, Pope Francis of today is more progressive than certain popes who were there before him. So what am I trying to say? That whether we like it or not, society maintains certain aspects but also changes other.
Do you think this is related to the need of the particular society at that point in time?
It is
or
related.
Or is it just something out of fashion?
No, it relates to various aspects. First of all, change doesn't necessarily come from above, that is from the leaders of society. Change can also come from below, from, for example, social movements, from civil society organizations who demand, who are active for change. For example, we speak of women's rights today, not because they fell out from the sky, but because in previous generations and even in today's generations, there are women who stand up for their rights and who speak up for women's rights, which again are different around the world. If you are a woman in Sweden and if you are a woman in Afghanistan, it's very different today.
Indeed.
So if you are a woman fighting for women's rights in Afghanistan, you have to be really brave. And women have died for such causes. The same can be said regarding racism. In various societies, racism wasn't defeated automatically. It was defeated because there were courageous people like Martin Luther King, like Nelson Mandela, who stood up for the rights of blacks in this case. So when we speak of change in society, change can come from above. Yes, it does. For example, in Malta, both major political parties brought about important changes during their years in power. But we also have to recognize the fact that very often various social groups in society, like civil society actors, like social movements, have also influenced political parties to bring about change. And I think that in our recent history in Malta, the LGBTIQ issue is a very good example in this regard. We can also mention the divorce issue. For example, I was active in the...
In fact, I was going to ask you, can you
Yes.
maybe mention other matters which have somehow formed our community's identity?
Yes. 10 years ago in Malta, a movement was formed to introduce the right to divorce. I was one of the founding members of that movement. Now, Malta had a very strange situation where you had a lot of people who were separating, who wished to marry again, but they couldn't. Because unlike practically all countries of the world, except for a very few, Malta did not have the right to divorce. Now, when the Yes movement, which I formed part of, was active to introduce divorce, it recognized the fact that Malta is a Catholic society, so it wasn't proposing a Las Vegas type of divorce, but it was proposing a divorce model which was similar to that of Ireland, which is another Catholic country in the EU. Now, today there are other proposals to make our law even more progressive, and that is something which is being debated within society. So that is part of democracy, and that is the beauty of democracy, in my opinion, that you have different views, different identities, as long as these identities respect one another and respect that they have different views, that is fine. The problem arises when you have identities which do not accept other views, which try to impose their views on others.
Then they will create barriers
Yes.
within the development of the communities and identities, right?
Yes, indeed. So one of the major issues in culture and society and regarding our communities today is how can we have different identities which coexist? And I believe that a key term in this regard is deliberation. Deliberation means that you communicate with others, even with others with whom you disagree. But you agree that there is a parameter, a democratic parameter. You agree that there are rules by which we must abide. Even perhaps, let me give you an example. You might be a Catholic, for example, who disagrees with divorce because of your religious beliefs. Perfectly fine. But that doesn't mean that because of your beliefs, you disallow other people from divorcing. If you do not want to divorce, or if you do not need to divorce, that's fine. But if there is a couple which requires a divorce so that they can remarry, for example, you shouldn't disallow them from doing so. And that was precisely the main argument of the Yes to Divorce movement a decade ago.
Whilst you were talking about those factors, I kind of thought of the migration process, which brings a lot of cultures and identities living together. In your opinion, what are the consequences that globalization and migration have for the national culture?
Yes, that is a very pertinent question, and it is a question which many people ask in their everyday lives. Many people are afraid of migration. Then again, many people are migrants themselves. I believe that it's a two-way process. On the one hand, I believe that societies should be open. And when I say societies should be open, I also take account of the fact that we are a small EU member state, the smallest EU member state. We are at the periphery of Europe, and perhaps we are taking more responsibilities than some countries which are much larger than us. Then again, there are large countries which take responsibilities too. So I believe we should, as a member state within the EU, it is important that the EU lives up to its responsibilities and shows solidarity to persons who are perhaps fleeing from very unfortunate situations like war. But on the other hand, I also believe that when a migrant enters a society, there are certain parameters which one must abide with. For example, if you live in a society which believes that genders are equal, I don't believe that you should enter a society and tell them, no, genders are not equal. If you want to believe that, you have the right to believe that. But in a society, you cannot expect that genders are not equal. For example, if you send your children to school, you cannot expect that boys are superior to girls, for example. So there are certain, this is what I mean by parameters, there are certain norms, certain cultures, certain cultural attitudes, which one must conform with. For example, today we are very much aware of gender violence. Now, if in some cultures gender violence is unfortunately acceptable, in our cultures in the European Union, that is unacceptable, even by law. So one must abide by that. When we speak of language, for example, I believe that it is only fair that if you want to go to live in another society, you try to learn the language or languages of a society. Now, in Malta, we know that there are various initiatives where migrants can learn English and Maltese, for example. So it is a two-way process.
So this kind of alters as well one's perception of identity, right? You start from point A and end up going to point Z and then maybe return to point B again.
Yes.
So it fluctuates, but in reality, then again, bottom line, it kind of goes down to what and where you have originated from.
Yes, there is a constant journey, so to speak, between one's roots and what goes on in one's journey of life. Now, I believe that the biggest challenge today is how we can combine these two together. For example, I am proud that I am Maltese. I am proud that the tiniest member state of the EU has its own national language. But I am also aware that we are part of a global society where, for example, it is important to know English as well. So, in one's journey, it is important.
These are also like coping strategies.
Yes.
I mean, because as you said, I speak Maltese, but I need to speak English as well, because in other countries, no one else might know how to speak Maltese. So I am finding a way through my identity and my culture to adopt and adapt to where I'm at.
Yes. So I think that the image could be one where different identities can learn and teach from each other. What I think we should be afraid of is when you have identities which try to deny the identities of other people.
And suffocate other people's culture and
identities.
And
unfortunately this exists in some societies, sometimes even within the same European Union.
It is very, very sad, and it's also sad to inform you, Dr. Briguglio, that our time is over. Unfortunately, 20 minutes are not enough to discuss such a topic, but it was a very, very interesting conversation. And to be honest, I gave you the space to share your knowledge with us, because I believe that the young people out there will definitely benefit from what you had to say. Thank you so much, Dr. Briguglio, and thank you, young people, for following Radju EU, powered by Eurodesk.